Ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever stood on the edge of a great unknown, that lions die moment before you leap, you know that silence right before the world changes? It's not made of fear or courage, but something far more fragile. The awareness that your next step will cost you everything familiar. Every major leap in human history begins not with technology, but with emotion, with a pulse in the human heart that says, maybe this could be better. When we look at the most celebrated minds in technology, we often assume their strength lies in logic, data, or the ability to outthink others. But when you look closer beneath the steel, the equations, and the bold statements, what you find is a human brain that feels as deeply as it thinks. And that is where the Untold story begins. Behind every algorithm, rocket, or neural interface lies something profoundly emotional. A question about meaning, about love, about why we keep trying, even when everything breaks. For decades, we've told the story of innovation as if it were a mechanical process. Code, build, test, launch. But the truth is, it's closer to biology than engineering. It's a heartbeat trying to synchronize with a dream. You see, the human brain doesn't innovate because it's rational. It innovates because it aches. Neuroscience has shown that inspiration is not born in the prefrontal cortex, the rational part, but in the limbic system, where emotion and memory live. The same circuits that make us fall in love or grieve are the ones that push us to create. And when someone pushes the boundaries of possibility as relentlessly as Elon Musk has, what you're really seeing is not a machine of logic, but a man in conversation with pain, trying to turn chaos into progress. We often forget that ambition at its core is an emotional survival strategy. When a child feels unseen, they dream bigger. When someone feels helpless, they invent control. When someone loses what they love, they try to build a world that can't be lost again. The path from emotion to innovation is written into the very architecture of the brain. Every neuron, wired by experience, every idea shaped by longing. And that's what fascinates me, because when you look at the life of a mind like this, a mind constantly pushing against impossibility, you see not just intellect, but emotional resilience refined by years of struggle. You see someone whose identity became fused with mission so deeply that personal life, rest, even love, begin to dissolve into purpose. We call it genius, but neuroscience might call it compensatory adaptation. It's when the emotional brain rewires itself around a singular idea, forming a neural fortress against despair. Against despair, it's not just focus, it's a neurological act of survival. To endure extraordinary stress, the brain learns to find meaning in pressure. And meaning, neurologically speaking, is dopamine's way of saying, keep going, it matters. Now imagine carrying that mechanism for years, the constant drive, the refusal to stop. You become addicted not to success, but to the act of solving, the act of saving. You start to see emotion itself as a problem to be engineered. And yet, underneath that steel logic, emotion never disappears. It mutates, it hides behind prototypes, rockets, and code. It becomes the invisible current that drives everything forward. There's a quiet loneliness that sits beneath that kind of life. I've seen it in the eyes of many brilliant innovators, a kind of internal exile. You reach a point where few can understand the language your brain speaks. You start to experience empathy differently, not as comfort, but as responsibility. Every failure in the world feels personal. Every barrier feels like an invitation to bleed for something larger. And yet there's beauty in that, because when you strip away the noise, the fame, the critics, what remains is a deeply human question. Can emotion and intellect coexist without destroying each other? That question lies at the heart of every innovation that has ever mattered. Think about it, the electric car, the reusable rocket, the neural interface. All of these ideas began as a feeling, a frustration, a fear, a longing. The same brain that engineers a rocket must also wrestle with loneliness. The same hand that draws the blueprint must tremble at night from exhaustion. And that paradox, that intersection between fragility and brilliance, is what makes this story profoundly human. I remember once watching a child build a small model rocket, struggling to make it stand upright. His eyes burned with frustration, his lips quivered, but he refused to stop. When he finally got it to launch, even if it only rose a few inches, he smiled as if he had touched the stars. That spark, that primal joy in creation never truly leaves us. It evolves, it becomes SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink. It becomes the adult version of that same emotional circuitry, the need to see something rise after falling. The untold emotional journey of innovation is not about triumph, it's about endurance, emotional endurance. Neuroscience tells us that the brain cannot distinguish between physical and emotional pain. To the amygdala, a failed rocket launch hurts as much as heartbreak. But while pain signals may be similar, how we interpret them shapes everything. In a resilient mind, pain becomes data. Suffering becomes pattern recognition. The failure of a launch becomes feedback for the next iteration, both in machines and in the self. The greatest breakthroughs often come from those who have learned to sit inside discomfort longer than others can bear, to hold paradox, to care deeply, yet act logically, to feel intensely, yet decide with clarity. This balancing act is not natural. It's trained, earned, fought for. It's what turns an emotional wound into an intellectual weapon. But here's what's even more fascinating. The brain of an innovator doesn't just process emotion differently, it metabolizes it. Through repeated exposure to uncertainty, the prefrontal cortex develops resilience. Each failure becomes a rehearsal for chaos. Each heartbreak trains the nervous system to stay calm under emotional fire. And over time, that person learns a kind of emotional physics, the ability to turn suffering into propulsion. It's why so many great inventors, artists, and scientists carry a hint of sadness in their eyes. Not because they're broken, but because they've learned the cost of dreaming at scale. You can't reimagine the human future without first grieving what's broken in the present. You can't build rockets without also building emotional tolerance for crash landings. Literal and metaphorical. We live in an age that worships intellect but misunderstands emotion. Emotion is not weakness, it is data. Every surge of frustration, every spark of awe, every quiet moment of doubt is the brain signaling something here matters. When someone like Musk feels the weight of the world and still builds anyway, that's not detachment, that's emotional intelligence in its rawest form. It's the ability to feel everything and still choose motion. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of this journey, not the success, but the survival, to wake up every day to criticism, uncertainty, and the near impossible and possible, yet still find the nerve to dream. That's not just engineering, that's emotional evolution. The brain adapts, yes, but the heart learns to find beauty in the unbearable. And when you truly understand that, when you realize that beauty can coexist with unbearable pressure, something inside you shifts. You stop measuring success by applause or valuation and start measuring it by emotional integrity, the quiet, knowing that you didn't abandon the part of you that still feels, because the truth is, the human brain doesn't want perfection. It wants connection. It thrives not on certainty, but on coherence. The feeling that even if the world is chaotic, your inner narrative still makes sense. For a person living in perpetual disruption, that coherence must be built from scratch every single day. The mind learns to find patterns where others only see noise. It builds meaning from fragments, and that's what separates ordinary persistence from visionary resilience. Most people survive change. A few translate chaos into architecture. They map the emotional turbulence of their own life into systems that other people can navigate. It's the neuroscientific equivalent of alchemy, turning pain into pattern into progress. You can almost see it in brain imaging. When a person reframes failure as feedback, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up, linking emotional pain to learning. It's the mind's way of saying, yes, this hurts, but it's useful. That single rewiring event is what allows someone to keep launching rockets after explosions, to keep building companies after collapse, to keep loving after loss. It's not superhuman. It's neuroplasticity guided by emotion, and yet for all its sophistication, the brain is still haunted by something older than science loneliness. Every visionary knows this feeling. It's the loneliness of being ahead of your time. the ache of seeing a future others aren't ready to believe in. The limbic system interprets isolation as danger, cortisol rises, sleep fragments, empathy wavers. But when that loneliness is channeled into creation, it becomes drive. You stop asking to be understood and start building the world that will one day understand you. That's what I see when I study the emotional architecture of great innovators. They are not detached. They are, paradoxically, more sensitive than most. Every criticism cuts deeper, every failure echoes longer, but instead of retreating, they metabolize those signals into fuel. The emotional brain becomes a kind of reactor, transmuting vulnerability into velocity. It's also why they're so polarizing. People sense that intensity. It's not arrogance. It's emotional overload wrapped in focus. The nervous system, when operating at the edge of human possibility, emits an energy that others misread as distance. But inside that distance is devotion, a relentless desire to make meaning tangible, to translate feeling into form. We often talk about artificial intelligence, Neuralink, Mars colonies, as if these are detached from emotion. But I see the opposite. Every one of those endeavors is a neurological mirror of longing. AI is the human wish to extend consciousness. Neural interfaces are the yearning to bridge understanding. Space exploration is grief turned outward, our refusal to accept separation as the final state. When we send rockets into the sky, we are reenacting an ancient neural ritual, the brain's refusal to stay confined by what it knows. Science calls it exploration, emotion calls it escape, but perhaps they are the same thing. Both are attempts to make the unbearable bearable, to find a horizon wide enough to hold our pain. In neuroscience, we know that the same neurotransmitters that activate curiosity also soothe anxiety. Dopamine doesn't just motivate, it heals. Each discovery momentarily restores balance. That's why relentless curiosity feels like salvation. It's a biochemical form of hope. And the deeper someone's emotional wounds, the more ferociously their brain chases that dopamine signal, not for pleasure, but for peace. I often wonder what the emotional cost of that pursuit really is. For a mind that operates at such speed, rest becomes foreign. The same neural patterns that enable genius also prevent stillness. You can't simply turn off the circuitry of obsession. It doesn't have a switch, only redirection. The price of seeing the future is living slightly detached from the present, and yet that detachment often becomes the birthplace of empathy on a global scale. When you can't connect easily to individuals, you start to connect to humanity itself. So the question becomes, how do you sustain emotional coherence when the world you're building constantly breaks the one you live in? The answer, paradoxically, is found not in machines, but in mindfulness. The innovators who last the longest are the ones who learn to return to their body, to treat emotion not as a distraction, but as an instrument. They breathe before they decide. They rest before they rebuild. They understand that the nervous system is not an obstacle to innovation. It is the foundation of it. The science supports this. Every act of creative problem solving begins with physiological regulation. When the vagus nerve is calm, when the heart rhythm stabilizes, the prefrontal cortex lights up, clarity emerges not from force, but from balance. You cannot build sustainable technology on an unsustainable nervous system. Humanity's next leap forward will not come from smarter algorithms. It will come from emotionally integrated minds. And this is where the untold emotional journey truly matters. It's not just one man's story. It's a reflection of the species. We are learning collectively how to pair emotional depth with cognitive speed, how to let feeling and logic dance rather than duel, how to engineer empathy into our equations. The brain's next evolution is not technological. It's relational. Think about what happens when someone decides to make electric cars mainstream or colonize another planet. On the surface, those are engineering feats, but beneath them lies an emotional hypothesis that humanity is worth saving, that we can be better than our impulses. That hypothesis requires faith. A profoundly emotional state rooted in the anterior insula, the brain's empathy hub. Faith in this context isn't spiritual, it's neurological optimism, the belief that our actions can still matter. Every time an innovator risks everything for a seemingly impossible dream, Their brain is performing an emotional gamble, trading certainty for meaning. And meaning, as neuroscience confirms, is the most powerful antidepressant known to the human mind. It keeps dopamine steady, it buffers cortisol, it rewires trauma into narrative. That's why people like this rarely stop. It's not ego, it's neurochemistry. Creation is their only form of emotional homeostasis. But even that system has limits. When the drive to solve becomes the only language the brain knows, isolation deepens. You start to realize that innovation doesn't heal you, it hides you. You can build rockets to the stars and still lie awake at night, wondering if anyone truly sees you. That's the hidden cost of brilliance, to illuminate the world while standing in your own shadow. And yet those shadows matter. They remind us that every breakthrough has a pulse behind it. That behind every launch, there is a heartbeat that once feared failure. Behind every invention, there is a nervous system quietly rewiring itself to keep believing. We talk about courage as if it's an external force, but courage is simply the body's refusal to let fear close the circuit. The untold emotional journey then is not about genius at all. It's about humanity, about how much feeling a mind can carry before it breaks, and how often breaking is the beginning of brilliance. When a rocket fails, it falls back to Earth. When a human fails, they fall inward. But sometimes from that inner impact, something extraordinary is born. Perspective. Perspective is the moment the emotional and rational brain finally synchronize. The prefrontal cortex stops arguing with the amygdala. The mind accepts what the heart already knows, that every act of creation is, at its core, an act of healing. And healing is messy, unpredictable, breathtakingly human. So when we look at a person who has redefined industries, it's tempting to see machines, numbers, headlines. But what we should see is a nervous system that refused to surrender to fear, a brain that took trauma and turned it into trajectory, a heart that kept beating in sync with a vision larger than itself. That to me is the true story, the one science alone can't measure. Because even as we chart the neurons, scan the cortex, decode the data, there remains one thing no technology can quantify: the human will to feel deeply and still move forward. And that is the essence of this emotional journey. Not perfection, not certainty, but motion, the decision every single day to keep reaching into the dark, trusting that somewhere beyond it, there is light. Ladies and gentlemen, that light is not in Mars or in machines. It is in us. The same circuits that spark empathy also spark invention. The same heart that breaks under pressure is the one that dares to love a future it may never see. And if we can hold on to that, if we can remain emotionally awake while intellectually bold, then the journey ahead, however difficult, will be the most meaningful chapter of our species yet. Because the real frontier is not space, it's the human heart. And the most advanced technology we will ever build is compassion.